Sexy strut, wanna get it poppin', baby, step right up. Some girls, they act retarded. Some girls are body. I'm looking for a girl that will do whatever the fuck I say. Every day she be giving it up. Shake that ass.
Muy buenos días, traders, espero que se encuentren todos muy bien. Arrancamos un nuevo día, una nueva transmisión ya. Vamos a empezar, tenemos 30 minutos para la nueva testificación de Powell. Me pueden confirmar si se escucha todo bien. Esta semana no fue como lo esperaba en realidad, con esta testificación dada por un adelanto el día de ayer, más lo que adelantaron también, la casi pausa confirmada, pues para mí ya es una confirmación de pausa. Porque están pidiendo datos más acelerados, eso sí, pero a pesar de que todavía está en un 74%, un 74% de que van a continuar subiendo. Para mí, con lo de ayer, con lo que habló, fue una pausa, y obviamente vimos esta caída ayer. Voy a marcar los stop loss porque ayer tuvimos 90 pips de stop loss, 369, sí, 90, póngamelo en 90 porque fueron euro dólar, USD CAD son 50 y en el oro son 30, son 80 pips, así que 90 no hay problema. Igual estamos como más de 500 pips, estamos en una relación 10-1 este mes todavía con temas de stop loss. Hemos superado los 500 pips y en stop loss ayer tuvimos 3 que serían pongámosle 80 pips. Y pues bueno, ¿por qué? Porque bueno, la verdad que esta semana he pasado bastante cansado y pues, estoy en diferentes cursos, estoy en diferentes pues bueno, con todas las empresas a full, a tope, con todas las cosas que hay que hacer, pues también de Midas a tope, así que según yo era mi año sabático, me pica, lo siento. Era mi año sabático y pues prácticamente estoy trabajando 15 horas diarias, con lo cual es bastante cansado. Y ayer pues no sé, mi cerebro no estaba funcionando bien porque cuando ya leímos lo de pausa teníamos que haber cancelado las operaciones y se acabó. Pero pues bueno, la dejamos correr y por eso el stop loss, por eso es que nos tocó stop loss. Que al final pues el mercado pues llegó nuevamente, pues ahorita ya están en lugares bastante inferiores, el oro en los 19.22. Hoy tuvimos también algunos datos. Tuvimos una subida de 50 puntos en Inglaterra y obviamente pues eso desentonaba con un poquito de fuerza a las libras que vimos un poco perder. Obviamente pues esto ya pasó, este punto de entrada se mantiene todavía en el rango, en un rango, o sea, al final todavía no ha superado este nivel, no ha ido a un nivel superior, ha perdido las libras un poco, pues, y acá prácticamente era la entrada a las 6 de la mañana, no operé, ya dejé de operar prácticamente. Así que dejé de operar por lo agitado que ha sido esta semana y por lo cansado que estaba. Recién ayer pude dormir prácticamente más de 6 horas, con lo cual pues me siento ya mucho más relajado. Y hoy vamos a tener testificación pues prácticamente en 20 minutos. Esta testificación es un poco más ligera, es la misma que ayer, obviamente pues no va a generar tanta volatilidad. Pero le van a hacer varios cuestionamientos a Powell. El día de ayer duró la conferencia, bueno, la testificación, alrededor de 3 horas. Con lo que hoy pues prácticamente sería una actualización de dónde estamos, qué estamos viendo. Voy a saludar mientras tanto. ¿Qué tal Santiago, Andrés, Fabián, Marlon? Muy buenos días. Buenos días a cada uno de ustedes. Y con eso pues vemos que las libras han subido 50 pips. Sorprende la subida de 50 pips. Ni tanto, porque al final la inflación en Inglaterra está por las nubes. Está todavía en 8.70. Es la única de los países más fuertes, o sea, de las potencias mundiales, que están por arriba del 7%. Está Inglaterra 8.70, Europa ya ha bajado de ese 7%, 6.10, Canadá 4.40 y Estados Unidos 4. Entonces sorprende que tenga la misma política monetaria prácticamente Estados Unidos e Inglaterra, casi la misma política monetaria, pero todavía no bajaran del 8.70, no bajan del 8.70. Por eso la subida de 50 puntos era necesaria, era totalmente necesaria. Y las libras obviamente pues perdieron un poco territorio y luego, bueno, mejor dicho, el dólar perdón, perdió un poco de territorio y luego recuperó valor. Si nos ponemos a comparar con otras monedas, igual los yenes perdieron y volvieron a bajar. Pues prácticamente ha sido tomado pues muy mal la subida de 50 puntos. Prácticamente no ha afectado en nada en los mercados. Recuerden que al no tener pares con las libras en el lado derecho, pues bueno, al final lo único que tenemos es operar. En este caso, pues prácticamente no hubiésemos encontrado nada. Nada. Muy volátil, bastante variado, bastante indecisión en los mercados. Y nada, tomada muy mal la subida de 50 puntos. Y eso pasa mucho, ¿saben? A ver, esto es un poco más, esto lo vamos a ver el 1 de julio también, pero en conclusión, voy a bajar un poquito más de la música, parece que está muy alta. En conclusión, es que todo es... No quiero hablar de especulación, los mercados son muy especulativos, eso sí, pero ya cuando tú eres analista financiero y te estás yendo por esa rama de estructurar un análisis financiero para poder hacer un análisis técnico, un análisis matemático y demás, muchas veces vas a tener todo el conocimiento del mundo y al final pues tú vas a tener que dar una decisión de acuerdo a tu criterio. ¿Por qué? Porque Inglaterra, en este ejemplo, ya, listo. Inglaterra, pues al final está con una inflación altísima y la subida de 50 puntos obviamente hubiese generado anteriormente un fortalecimiento a su moneda. Como ya están prácticamente reaccionando a la inflación alta y a las crisis, no están tomando datos, o sea, no están dando subidas en antelación, se puede decir, como lo hizo Estados Unidos, como lo hizo Europa, y están avanzando un poco más fuertes por lo que recién están viendo datos, realmente no lo toman muy bien en los mercados. Entonces, ese tipo de análisis, de reacción que tú tienes que tomar, al final pues ya viene mucho de tu práctica, de tu información, sí, pero ya después de pasar tiempo, pues te vas a dar cuenta de este tipo de situaciones, que al final las libras iban a subir 25 o 50 puntos, pero no lo iban a tomar bien, porque al final pues están reaccionando en vez de tomar, se puede decir, medidas cautelares, se puede decir, sobre lo que está haciendo la inflación, y es por eso que vemos este tipo de reacciones y el mercado bastante indeciso. ¿Qué es lo que pasa? El índice dólar ha venido a recuperar un poco del territorio caído. Podríamos estar viendo nuevas caídas, deberíamos estar viendo nuevas caídas con una pausa a la vuelta de la esquina, que todavía no lo están confirmando en general. Eso hay que estar pendientes de este tipo de reuniones como el miembro del FONC, ya lo vamos a ver, a pesar de que es al igual que la de Powell, pero pues el índice dólar no puede sobrepasar los 100. Ok, no puede sobrepasar la línea de los 100. No lo va a hacer, no lo van a permitir. Así que lo que nosotros tenemos que estar viendo es la posibilidad de una próxima llegada a estos niveles de 100. Y nuevamente pues tener rebotes que puedan estar acelerando el mercado hacia arriba. ¿Cuándo? Para que llegue por acá, pues pueden ser semanas, meses, no tantos meses, pero meses. Me refiero a 2-3 meses, pero para eso pues es mejor estar operando quizás esta posibilidades de caídas. Me refiero a estas posibilidades. No me gusta operar esto. Para mí operar esto es que ya la tendencia se me fue hace rato. Obviamente pues tendríamos una posibilidad operativa de 125 pips, nada malo, para poder llegar a estos niveles nuevamente, para llegar nuevamente a estos niveles. Y no está mal 125 pips, pero para mí se me fue. O sea, para mí la entrada era esta, que la vimos anteriormente cuando existieron datos. Cuando hubo datos, pues estábamos esperando esta, pero ¿qué es lo que pasó? No cayó y se nos fue un montón. Prácticamente 344, que era nuestra nuestra entrada swing increíble. Prácticamente con eso teníamos el mes más que asegurado. Pero al final pues no se dio. Esta es la posibilidad de la entrada. No me gusta tanto por lo arriba que está, pero estaríamos viendo al menos una entrada. Esta sería una entrada que estaríamos tomándola como una relación 4-1. Nada mal. Hasta 2-1 estaríamos bien. Hasta 2-1 estaríamos bien. Estamos esperando ya la testificación nueva de Powell, que estará dándose en exactamente 17 minutos. Me interesa más también lo que hable Bowman, porque ayer sorprendió en la testificación. ¿Dónde está? Ayer fue 21. ¿Y por qué eliminaron la testificación de Powell? ¿Soy yo o eliminaron la testificación de Powell? La sacaron del sistema. Interesante, no pasa nada, acá tenemos esta. Ya por eso es que les pasé, qué raro, sacaron del sistema. Esta es la misma, solo que en PDF. Y aquí tenemos pues lo que había hablado de la pausa, que al final lo que está diciendo es que bueno, todavía hay datos. Bueno, a pesar de que dice reunión tras reunión, lo que habló ayer en la noche ya no había, vaya, sí, a veces suelen bajarla del sistema, suelen hacer algunas correcciones para el día de hoy. Suelen hacer eso, así que suelo descargarme. Ya, justamente esta parte. Committee of Target to access additional information and this application for monetary policy. Con lo cual, pues, aquí te estaba diciendo que hay que esperar un poco. Que en la anterior reunión varias personas estaban esperanzadas que en la siguiente se suban tipos. Pero dicen que tienen que ser más cautelosos para ver qué está pasando. Pero que van a hacerlo reunión tras reunión como lo han venido haciendo siempre. Pero la cuestión es que al final pues me están diciendo, hey, vamos a tener que esperar. O sea, me están dando ya los indicios de una pausa. No me están diciendo, sí, nos hemos dado cuenta que con esta pausa que ya hicimos anteriormente y con los datos que estamos obteniendo, nos estamos visualizando a posible unas nuevas subidas de tipos de interés que se verán reunión tras reunión. O bueno, decidiremos si hay subidas reunión tras reunión, que es diferente. Por más que suene a lo mismo decirte, veremos si hay nuevas subidas reunión tras reunión, a la diferencia de es mejor esperar un poco para tomar decisiones de que si va a haber subidas o no. O sea, es exactamente lo mismo en lenguaje español, es exactamente lo mismo. O sea, te estoy diciendo que hay que esperar a ver si vamos a tener subidas en el primer punto y en el segundo hay que esperar para tomar una decisión de subida. Entonces, prácticamente lo mismo, pero es diferente por dónde se va tomando estos tipos de anuncios para saber si hay subida o bajada. O pausa, mejor dicho, pausa. No va a haber bajada este año. Pausa. Con lo cual, sorprendieron un poco a los mercados. No tanto, porque obviamente faltan las preliminares, faltan datos, faltan un montón de cosas. Pero ya me está diciendo, oye, la posibilidad de una pausa está mucho mayor. No lo han tomado así de esa manera los grupos que están, por ejemplo, CM Group, no lo ha tomado, no ha dicho nada. CM Group no ha dicho nada, todavía continúa en un 74%. Y pues futuros del oro y demás, pues se han mantenido bastante bien. En realidad está bastante bien. Han venido a perder un poquito, pero pues obviamente es la pérdida de los valores de los 2000. Pero está bastante bien, está en un posicionamiento de 19.33 los futuros, que están bastante bien. Obviamente sí ha caído un 10%, pero vuelvo a repetir, están bastante bien los futuros. Y también pues vamos a revisar índices y demás de la forma más rápida antes de empezar. Pues han tenido una recuperación por la posible pausa y demás. Pues el Nasdaq ha crecido en 21%, pero el Standard & Poor's y el Dow Jones han perdido en menos 33%. Si nos vamos al índice, a los índices como el Nasdaq, pues al final estamos viendo que los mercados pues se han venido a recuperar un poco, pero se ha quedado todavía por estas zonas. Se han quedado por estas zonas. Me da un momento. Listo amigos, continuamos y al final pues bueno, lo que les estaba comentando es que los índices pierden un poco más de territorio, vuelven a recuperar un poco, pues están recuperándose un poquito más. En realidad todo consolidado, la reunión de esta vez, la testificación de esta vez de Powell pues no ha sido tan fuerte como la primera. Andrés dice, ¿será que se actualiza ya mismo que salga la segunda parte de la transmisión? Sí. En realidad lo tienen que hacer porque no deberían haberle dado de baja en realidad. O sea, debería estar acá, está eliminada. Está eliminada. Y tenemos en 8 minutos ya pues que va a hablar Powell, pero todavía no hay ninguna actualización. En vivo en las cámaras, pues en Financial Service no está nada. Todavía están en vivo, pero miren esta cara perdida. Recién reaccionó. Quiero ver si por acá ya están preparándose. Es que esta comparecencia, mejor dicho, va a ser ya en el Senado. En el Senado. Entonces, pongámosle esto de fondo que se ve mucho más bonito que estar viendo técnico. Listo, entonces, ya está, ya la tengo lista la transmisión. Ya está lista la transmisión, yo ya estoy listo. Vamos a esperar todavía 8 minutos. Vamos a esperar esos 8 minutos. Que ya se viene, que va a ser frente al Senado. Vamos a ver qué es lo que va a comentar, qué es lo que va a decir. Esperemos que realmente pues sea interesante. Este es el segundo round, se puede decir. Y vamos a ver en esta vez lo chiquitito que es Powell enfrente al Congreso. Así que al Senado, mejor dicho. Ya lo vamos a ver. ¿Qué más? En mercados pues lentos, bastante lentos. No me gustan. O sea, yo esperaba realmente pues que Powell ayer no diga lo de la pausa y diga que el dólar está fuerte, que se está recuperando, que, perdón, debería recuperarse mucho más y bueno, bla, 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 bla. Pero hay cancha para que baje, o sea, esta bajada de acá, que les estaba diciendo en varios meses, es prácticamente lo que estaríamos viendo. La mitad de movimiento, o casi la mitad de movimiento de la crisis, desde el anuncio de la crisis bancaria. Casi la mitad de movimiento de la crisis bancaria. Entonces, todavía hay la posibilidad, o sea, todavía es un gran movimiento esto. Entonces hay cancha todavía para tenerlo acá al dólar, para que al final no baje de los 100. Está prohibido para el dólar bajar de los 100, o sea, no va a bajar. Les apuesto lo que quieran que no va a bajar de los 100. Al menos, no va a bajar de los 100. Es que no puedo decirles al menos este año, es que no va a bajar de los 100. Podríamos estar viendo nuevas caídas. Recuerden que prácticamente, pues tomando en cuenta lo del anuncio de las crisis bancarias que se han venido recuperando, prácticamente es el movimiento que tiene la mitad. Así que tiene mucha cancha. Mucha cancha. Mucha cancha. Así que tenemos que estar esperando ya a la testificación de Powell, que parte ya en 8 minutos. Estamos ya en vivo con la CNBC Television, que en 5:22, 5:21, 5:20 y sigue contando hacia abajo, que al final empezaremos la transmisión. Andrés dice: en 1 hora el oro va dejando velas de indecisión, pero no será capaz que mejor después de esto ver entrada. Yo personalmente ya se acabó mi trading ayer, porque ayer cometí ese error de prácticamente ya leímos pausa y continuamos. Debimos haber cortado las operaciones e irnos hasta en contra de justamente de eso, porque estábamos esperando que se fortalezca. Si hubiese debilitado, hubiésemos obtenido no mucho, pero algo. 87, 60 pips por ahí, que al final los toqué en stop loss y que estaba cantado, pero al final estaba ayer ya cansado. Ya cerramos transmisión y tenía que continuar trabajando y tenía todo el trabajo acumulado de empresas acumuladas. Al final, pues de nuevos negocios que estoy partiendo, entonces es bastante trabajo, lo cual por lo tanto estaba demasiado cansado, y al final pues ayer tomamos esos pequeños errores que los dejé por ahí. Así que para mí ya adiós. Hoy día tendríamos que ver la nueva testificación, pero no va a haber tanto cambio en realidad. Van a hablar lo mismo, van a hacer las mismas preguntas. Ayer era lo más importante, hoy no tanto. Bowman ya está hablando, me gustaría ver dónde está Bowman hablando y qué es lo que está diciendo, pero en la Reserva Federal ya está en vivo. Pero no lo encuentro en donde está en vivo. Santiago dice: este es el verdadero trading, se gana y se pierde. Sí, pero es que por errores humanos, obviamente va a haber bastantes errores humanos, somos humanos, nos equivocamos, pero lo de ayer sí fue yéndose a lo... no sé, pone una mala palabra ahí, porque al final eso se puede corregir. Son súper simples, al final son sumamente simples. Ya que me equivoque en otros aspectos que puedan ser un poco más complejos, sí, pero lo de ayer era decirles eliminar y le dejé correr y no sé qué me pasó. Mi cabeza estaba en otro lado. Y me está pasando eso porque estoy tan cansado que al final quiero que sea fin de semana, porque este fin de semana pasado también pasé trabajando a full. ¿Qué es lo que pasa? Lo que pasa es que, bueno, hay algunos negocios que estoy arrancando y como inicios de negocios tú tienes que ser la cara y estar al 100%, y tienes que hacer un montón de cosas, dejar colocado un montón de cosas, y eso realmente desgasta. No le veo. Está en pre-release. Está la última, el 06, 0522, 0622 es la nuestra. No está. En speech. No está. Y en interviews tampoco está. Esto es de la funk pura y dura, así que no. No me da link, no me da link. Me mandaron para acá, pero... Esto es lo que va a hablar. ¿Qué fecha estamos? Entonces, de que puedes ganar y perder, claro está. Pero hay algunas que al final te dejan... Que al final te dejan, o sea, al final vas a poder tomar, vas a poder ver errores que al final pues puedes corregirlos tranquilamente. Lo de ayer fue un error que se tenía que haber corregido. Pues no, no lo tenemos. ¿Me está dando data? No. No, porque son los primeros días del mes, da información, da data. ¿No tenemos link? No tenemos link. Obviamente pues ya estamos esperando a que Powell empiece. Ya son las 9, todavía no empieza. No sé si tenemos algún retraso por ahí. Sí, estamos con retraso, todavía no empieza. No hay nada todavía en YouTube. Veamos en Federal Reserve. No sé qué está pasando con los links. No, es que todo fue dicho ayer, sí, pero al final... Al final tienen que transmitir. Y la de Bauman no la encuentro. Tenemos que esperar. O sea, pudo haber dicho todo ayer, pero hoy es pública y tiene que ser sí o sí transmitida. Sí o sí transmitida. No suben el link todavía a la página oficial. Parece que se retrasa. ¿Qué hora es la hora del este? La hora del este son las 10 de la mañana. O sea, estamos con una hora. Sí, estamos bien a las 9. Los únicos que están transmitiendo ahora son CNBC. La CNBC, pero al final tampoco ellos abren transmisión. Y está CBS también News, pero todavía no abren transmisión. Todavía no abren transmisión. Hay varios todavía que no inician todavía testificación. Vaya, hay un canal que está en inglés transmitiendo casi igual que yo. Pero, uff, 4000 personas conectadas, qué locura. Bueno, vamos para eso, vamos para eso. Les agradezco a las 18 personas que están conectadas acá. Realmente les conozco prácticamente a todos, así que prefiero 1000 veces eso. Bueno, la vieja confiable. Nos vamos directo al Senado. Y Powell ya empieza, Powell ya empiza.
American workers, we need plentiful job opportunities, we need high wages, we need low prices. Price way to increase their profits. They always find a way. Financial crisis, profits go up.
No sé cuál está sonando.
War in Europe, profits go up. Increasing energy costs, profits go up. When supply chains ground to a halt when Putin invaded Ukraine and the economy reopened and demand surged everywhere at once,
Empezamos con la
everywhere
transmisión.
all at once, the rest of us saw problems to solve. But in many corporate boardrooms, executives instead saw an opportunity.
Déjeme sacar
The
estas
largest
páginas
multinational corporations,
para ir revisando
inflation has
todo,
been
¿ok?
a perfect
Para estar-
excuse to increase profits by
para
raising
estar revisando
prices
todo
far
por atrás.
beyond the costs of their
por fuera de
inputs.
cámara.
The main tool that many in this town look toward
Quiero
to
ver la
rescue us from
transmisión
inflation,
también, a ver si
hiking
lo
interest
tenemos en
rates,
español.
can do little to solve that problem. It's a little wonder then that when American workers
Porque
see
para
the
la
high prices
traducción,
at the
ya
grocery
saben,
store, at the
soy
pharmacy
cero a la
counter, at the
izquierda.
gas pump, along with rising borrowing costs for mortgages and credit cards and car loans, they remain skeptical of government and its willingness to address the challenges people face. Inflation, of course, is a complex problem. The Fed's been fighting it with a blunt tool, and we made progress. Inflation is at the lowest level in the last 2 years, giving hope that the price of consumer goods will continue to decline.
Bueno, están hablando
And
sobre
despite
los
the
precios del
experts' prediction,
consumidor,
job
que
growth
ya
remains
está mejor
strong.
que es el
The
IPC.
country added 339,000 new jobs in May. Ohio's
En
unemployment
mayo
rate
han crecido empleo a
3.6% is the
339.
state's lowest in
El,
20 years.
el desempleo ha
Unemployment for black
subido
and
hasta un
brown
rango del
Americans
6%.
remains near historic lows.
Que
Think about
hace
what
20
actually
años
means
no
for
había
workers
esos
in,
niveles tan
in
altos de
Alabama, and
desempleo.
Ohio, and
Ojo
North
que esto es
Dakota, and
reunión Howrey
Louisiana, and
Hawkins,
Minnesota,
así
and
que
South
obviamente van
Carolina.
a pelear por el
What that actually
desempleo,
means for
por
workers
los
all over the
datos de
country. It
IPC,
means
por los
Americans
datos
have
del
more
PIB.
opportunity and choice in their lives, even in places they haven't seen a lot of options in recent years. It means people have the power to demand raises and retirement security and paid sick days and control over their schedules. It means more Americans have the dignity of work that comes with a good job. That
Ver
can
cómo
provide for your
pueden
family.
hacer que más
And
americanos
look where that
consigan un
kind
digno
of power
trabajo y
for
demás
workers is
para
taking
apoyar
us
a sus
last
familias y
month.
demás.
Wage growth outpaced inflation. That's the way it should be. Today's hearing
Hablando
comes at
sobre
a
los
critical
datos de
time. Last week,
inflación,
the Fed decided to pause interest rate hikes
sobre
after
lo que
10
la
consecutive
Fed
increases and to maintain the rate at its
aceptó
current
incrementar
level.
en 25 puntos.
For the many of us who are concerned that further rate hikes could do more harm than good, it's welcome news. The challenge you face, Chair
Que quieren
Powell, is to
escuchar
ensure that
sobre si al
workers
final,
continue to
pues
see
si hay
higher
nuevas
wages
noticias,
while also
están
continuing to rein in
dispuestos a
inflation.
escuchar
In
sobre
previous
los
hearings,
datos que
you've
se han
noted
venido a dar
with
de inflación
justifiable pride
y sobre los
how
tipos de
careful
interés.
management of the economy helped millions of workers return to the job market. It's those workers who stand to lose the most if the Fed overdoes its rate hikes, loses sight of the dual mandate, and drives the unemployment rate back up. As you've also noted, Mr. Chair, increasing interest rates is not
Regresar
the
a
only
los
tool we
datos de
have to fight
desempleo a lo
inflation.
normal.
The Fed is not the only one with a role to play. Congress, the administration, everyone in government, and corporate boardrooms must do their part. There's no reason we can't continue coming together to bring prices down. More policymakers are finally recognizing what those of us in Ohio have known for years, that outsourcing the production of pretty much everything may mean higher profits in the short term, but it won't lead to a resilient economy with a strong middle class in the long term. We've taken steps to strengthen our supply chains and hiring and bring critical manufacturing back to the U.S.
Hablando también sobre lo crítico que está la manufactura, obviamente los datos del PMI.
Lowering demand, which is just economics textbook jargon for making people poorer, laying off workers, denying raises. Instead of lowering demand, we can produce more, we can build more, we can grow the economy from the middle out. It's also our first semi-annual report from the Fed since the string of bank failures this spring.
Hablando
Those
sobre
failures
los
were caused by the
reportes
same
acerca
issue
del
at the heart of so many
problema
of
de
our
los
economic
bancos.
problems. It's the Wall Street business model. Executives lay off
Hablando
workers,
sobre
they put
el
short-term
modelo de
increases
negocios
in
de Wall
quarterly
Street.
profits and their own compensation above everything and everyone
Bueno, en
else.
realidad está dando un
At
tema
Silicon
general
Valley
de
Bank and
todo, de
Signature Bank, those
absolutamente
in
todo lo
charge
que van a
pushed their
hablar el día
banks
de
to
hoy.
grow too big, too fast. They made risky bets. They got
Cómo
massive profits.
rescataron a los
Executives were paying
bancos,
themselves
cómo, bueno,
bonuses right
necesita
up
que
until the
explique
moment
Powell toda
that
esa
at least
parte.
one of these banks crashed. To most Americans, that's not surprising. People have gotten all too used to big bankers treating the industry more like a game, or maybe more precisely, an endless ATM for themselves, secure in the knowledge they won't pay any real price if things go wrong. Mr. Chairman, as Senator Scott and I teamed up on a 21-2 vote yesterday, those days for bank executives are over. Chair Powell, I look forward to hearing today how the Fed will protect
Bueno, van a
American
hablar
workers in the fight
hacerle
against
hablar a
inflation
Mr.
and
Scott.
promote an economy with a strong, growing middle class.
Todos los problemas que tienen que hablar, pues bueno, todas las cosas,
Chairman.
ahora sí ya entra
Chair
Mr.
Powell,
Scott.
thanks for joining us today. Such an important time. Your last appearance before this committee was about 4 months ago, just days before the collapse of two banks. And while we continue to investigate those bank
Hablando
failures,
sobre el
it's
problema que
important
pasó
to
anterior
examine
sobre
the
el tema de
macro
los
factors,
bancos.
such as rising interest rates that contributed to the bank failures and the current economic stresses American families face every single day. Looking through the lens, I want to turn to you
No
in
se
your role
olviden
as
darle
Chairman
me
of the
gusta
Federal
al
Reserve, a role that
video,
requires constant
a la
scrutiny
transmisión en
because the
vivo.
American people deserve nothing
Todavía no
less
empieza,
than the best we can offer
Powell,
them.
están hablando
The greatest
sobre...
opportunity to succeed
A ver,
and the
la
strongest
ley
tools to
Henry
pave their
Hawkins
path.
hace que al final pues el
Unfortunately,
Congreso y el
the bank
Senado
failures
hagan
earlier this year shook
Powell
confidence in
tiene
our
que
financial
decirles
system.
cómo están las
But
cifras, qué tal
thankfully,
todo
our
para
healthy and
evitar
well-managed institutions
una
stepped
nueva
up, and we have
recesión
been
como la que existió
able to
hace
weather the
muchos
storm.
años atrás en Estados
However,
Unidos.
I've been consistently
Entonces, por eso es
disappointed
que le están dando la
in your
introducción
deputy,
de,
Vice
tienes que
Chair
hablar
of
sobre
Supervision, Michael Barr.
desempleos, tienes que
Just
hablar sobre
yesterday, this
manufacturas,
committee
sobre
passed, as
inflación,
Chairman
sobre los
Brown
tipos de
just said,
interés.
near unanimous legislation to encourage good corporate governance, but not just that. We also wanted to focus on the supervisory failure that was a part of the legislation. Those are not the same actions taken by
No sé por qué
Michael
todos
Barr.
tienen la mirada perdida.
I asked
Este
him
chico
twice
también, bueno, no lo están viendo en
when
la
he was here
transmisión, pero
before the committee,
yo lo estoy
if he
viendo
would
en la
fire
pantalla
bad bank
completa y tiene la mirada,
supervisors
pero
for the
totalmente
supervisory
perdida, está
neglect
apagado.
that contributed to the epic failures of SVB and Signature, he would not commit to doing anything. And I would ask you in your role as the active executive officer, if you would take some action firing those responsible for missing what was glaringly obvious now to all of America, certainly should have been obvious to the supervisors. I've said from the beginning that this has been a failure in three parts, the SVB and Signature.
Esto
It was a
va,
failure of the bank execs, the action that we took
quiere que hable en
21 to
tres
2
partes sobre
yesterday,
la crisis de los
reinforces
bancos.
Congress is willing to take the lead and hold bank executives accountable. Second failure was a supervisory
fallo,
failure, and that requires
los
the Fed
fallos de los
to hold
supervisores
folks
de la Fed,
accountable
o sea, hacia la
just
Fed.
like Congress did.
Está
And
hablando de
third,
tres fallos
the
de
Biden
los bancos
inflationary economy
prácticamente
that has
de...
drove prices really high and resulted in 10 rate increases from you all. In the
Que
wake of
sobre la
Silicon
subida,
Valley's bank's downfall, as the vice chair released his report on the failures, we heard directly from you that your role was to announce it, to get briefed on it, but not necessarily to be involved in the work of it. So my question is, as you watch Vice Chair Barr roll out higher capital standards, it seems like your very clear statements is that you will be supporting as well as working to implement Vice Chair Barr's recommendations. But as you know, that the other members of the board, Governor Bowman has recently said that Mr. Barr wrote a report on Silicon Valley Bank's failure that provided his conclusions and went on to state that the report should be used to help guide discussions among policymakers, not necessarily just to rush towards implementation of Vice Chair Barr's recommendations. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that path forward, if in fact your job is to rubber stamp the decisions of
Bueno, todavía estoy
Vice
viendo a
Chair
ver si hay una
Barr,
transmisión en
or
español,
is your responsibility to take into
porque el tema de
consideration the
traducir sí se
Vice
me hace
Chair's
bastante complicado. Hay palabras
recommendations
que entiendo
and then chart a
y no, y
path that
sobre
seems
todo
to be
las personas
consistent
que
with
hablan,
what
a
is in the
veces les
best
entiendo y a veces
interest
que y a veces
of our
que no.
nation and, frankly, of our financial institutions. I do not believe that increasing significantly the capital standards is in the best interest of small businesses or people looking for loans. The more capital we put on the sidelines, the less capital there is for us to see our financial institutions loaning the money out. I look forward to continuing our discussion during the question and answer time.
Bueno,
Thanks,
entonces ahí
Scott.
sí ya le da la
Today we'll hear
palabra
from the Chair of the
nuevamente
Federal
para que hable,
Reserve,
a ver
Jerome
si...
Powell, on monetary policy and the state of our economy. Thank you for your public service, Chair Powell, and
Primero le está
please present
agradeciendo
your testimony.
sobre
Thank you.
el espacio
Thank you,
por su
Chairman
trabajo
Brown.
de
Thank
por
you,
su
Ranking Member
servicio
Scott,
general.
and other members of the committee.
Dese
I
cuenta cómo
appreciate
está
the
sentado
opportunity
ya.
to present the Federal Reserve's semi-annual monetary policy report.
Va a hablar igualito de lo de ayer.
We at the Fed remain squarely focused on our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people.
Si quieren que les
My colleagues
traduzca,
and I
pues les
understand
puedo
the
traducir,
hardship
es
that high
exactamente lo
inflation
mismo.
is causing, and we remain strongly committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal.
Que quieren trabajar para
Price
llevar la
stability is
inflación
the
al
responsibility of
2%.
the Federal Reserve, and
Por esto
without
ya
it,
lo
the
saben, en
economy
realidad,
does
las
not
personas que
work
se
for
conectaron
anyone.
ayer ya saben qué
In
es lo que va a
particular,
hablar. Esto es
without price
exactamente
stability,
igual.
we will not achieve a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. I'll review the current economic situation and then turn to
Exactamente
monetary
igual.
policy. The U.S. economy slowed
Todas las
significantly
personas
last
en
year,
Estados
and
Unidos
recent
tienen la mirada
indicators
perdida.
suggest that economic activity has continued to expand at a modest pace. Although growth in consumer spending has picked up this year, activity in the housing sector remains weak, largely reflecting higher mortgage rates. Higher interest rates and slower output growth also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment. The labor market remains very tight. Over the first 5 months of the year, job gains averaged a robust
No se olviden
314,000 jobs
suscribirse,
per
amigos,
month.
darle me gusta,
The unemployment rate
compartirlo
moved
con
up,
más
but it remained
personas.
low in May at 3.7%. There are some signs that supply and demand in the labor market are coming into better balance. The labor force participation rate has moved up in recent months, especially for individuals aged 25
Esto
to
es
54.
exactamente lo que dijo ayer.
Nominal wage growth has shown some
Es el
signs of
mismo
easing,
discurso.
and job vacancies have declined so far this year. While the jobs to workers gap has narrowed, labor demand still substantially exceeds the supply of available workers. Inflation remains well above our longer run goal of 2%.
Es lo
Over
mismo
the
que ayer.
12
El
months
oro
ending in
cayendo
April,
un
total personal consumption, or
0.69%.
PCE, prices rose
Eurodólar
4.4%,
estático.
excluding the volatile food and energy categories. Core PCE prices rose 4.7%. In May, the 12-month change in the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, came in at 4.0%, and the change in the core CPI was 5.3%. Inflation has moderated somewhat since the middle of last year. Nonetheless, inflation pressures continue to run high, and the process of getting inflation back down to 2% has a long way to go. Despite elevated inflation, longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures
El
from
mismo
financial
discurso de
markets.
ayer. Exactamente igual el mismo discurso de ayer.
With inflation remaining well above our longer-run goal of 2% and
Creo
with
que
labor
son hasta
market
las mismas
conditions remaining
hojas.
tight, the FOMC has
Por cierto,
significantly
bonito
tightened the
reloj el de
stance
Powell.
of monetary policy. We have raised our policy interest rate by 5 percentage points since early last year, and we've continued to reduce our security holdings at a brisk pace. We've been seeing the effects of our policy tightening on demand in the most interest rate sensitive sectors of the economy. It will take time, however, for the full effects of monetary restraint to be realized, especially on inflation. The economy is facing headwinds from tighter credit conditions for households and businesses, which are likely to weigh on economic activity, hiring, and inflation.
Sí, quiero ver si
The
la
extent
Reserva
of these
Federal
effects
volvieron ya a
remains
subir
uncertain.
el
In light of how
discurso
far
y
we
no.
have come in tightening policy, the uncertain lags with which monetary policy affects the economy, and potential
le dieron a la
headwinds from
baja el
credit
discurso
tightening,
de Powell de
the
ayer.
FOMC decided last week to maintain the target range for the federal funds rate at 5 to 5.25%, and to continue the process of significantly reducing our securities holdings. Nearly all FOMC participants expect that it will be appropriate to raise interest rates somewhat further by the end of the year. But at last week's meeting, considering how far and how fast we've moved, we judged it prudent to hold the target range steady to allow the committee to assess additional information and its implications for monetary policy. In determining the extent of additional policy firming that may be appropriate to return inflation to 2% over time, we will take into account the cumulative tightening of monetary policy, the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation, and economic and financial developments. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting based on the totality of incoming data
Ella dijo
and
lo
their
de la
implications
pausa y que
for
va a
the
ser
outlook
reunión
for
tras
economic activity
reunión,
and
van a
inflation,
tomar decisiones
as
reunión
well
tras
as the
reunión.
balance of risks. We remain committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2%
Esta
goal
reunión no
and to
es
keeping
tan
longer-term
importante como
inflation
la que era de
expectations
ayer. Y
well
me
anchored.
sorprende que ayer no hubo tanta
Reducing
volatilidad,
inflation
o
is
sea,
likely
hoy
to require a
prácticamente los
period of
mercados van a
below-trend
estar
growth
quietos.
and some softening of labor market conditions. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for
Ya mismo
achieving
termina.
maximum
Ya
employment
mismo termina.
and stable prices over the long run. Before concluding, let me briefly address the condition of the banking sector. The U.S. banking system is sound and resilient. As detailed in the box on financial stability in the June Monetary
Ahí
Policy
está hablando
Report,
de los bancos
the
en la
Federal
parte
Reserve,
final,
together with
que
the Treasury
como ayer, que
Department
había
and the
dicho, se tomó ese
FDIC,
tiempo para decir
took
que están bien.
decisive action in March to protect
Oro
the
ya
U.S.
bajó
economy and to strengthen public confidence in our banking
0.69%,
system.
0.7.
The recent bank failures, including the failure of Silicon Valley Bank and the resulting bank stress, have highlighted the importance of ensuring that we have the appropriate rules and supervisory
Esta
practices for
semana
banks
hizo
of
que
this
yo no
size.
opere
We're
porque
committed to addressing these
prácticamente
vulnerabilities to make for a stronger and more resilient banking system. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you.
como les dije, ya
Thank you,
estaba
Chair
por
Powell.
terminar, ya terminó.
Paul Donovan at UBS has discussed the role that corporate profiteering plays in persistent inflation. While inflation has fallen from 9%, as you know, it has peaked to 4%, prices continue to climb because of supply shortages and corporate profiteering, what we're starting to call greedflation. Given that rising interest rates certainly won't solve greedflation, why maintain interest rates at the current level or even consider, as you suggested, raising them again, given the risk of harming the livelihoods of more than 1.5 million workers and their families?
Mr. Chairman, the committee broadly feels that
Aquí empiezan ya
while monetary
las
policy has gotten
preguntas.
to an appropriately restrictive level, if the economy performs about as expected, that it will be appropriate to raise hikes again this year and perhaps twice. A strong majority of the committee feels that it will be appropriate again, assuming that the economy performs as expected 2 times before the end of this year.
Les
We've
voy a
come
dejar un
very
momento
far,
por acá,
and the reason why
regreso de
we
inmediato.
maintained our rate at the last meeting was to give ourselves more time to stretch out the time for making these decisions. We moved very quickly at the beginning, and we've gradually slowed down. This is just a continuation of that. But we are committed to getting inflation under control, and the strong majority of the committee feels that we're close, but there's a little further to go with rate hikes.
Well, thank you for that answer, but Mr. Chair, what Fed governors call cooling down, regular people where I live call them layoffs. I mean, the question is, why should working families continue to bear the cost of fighting inflation? Why should they lose their jobs so that corporate profits can continue to balloon? Let me move to the next question. Our economy's created 13 million new jobs in the last 2.5 years. Black and Latino workers with the lowest incomes, have seen the greatest gains in job opportunity and wage growth. What the Fed considers too hot an economy has given these workers their first leg up in decades, if ever. We know that job losses will hurt those same workers the most. How will higher interest rates and the resulting job losses disproportionately impact Black and Latino and low-income workers?
Well, we have quite an unusual situation in the labor market where we've had persistently much higher demand for workers than the available supply of workers. So some of the process of getting demand and supply back into alignment has been taking place through declining job openings and through lower quits rates and through wages that are moving, that are still very high, but moving into more sustainable levels of increase. So actually there hasn't been a meaningful increase in unemployment. The unemployment rate has bounced around at historically low levels, and that's fine. That would be the perfect way for this to continue to happen. There's no guarantee that will happen. I would just say that it is working families who suffer most directly and quickly from high inflation, and it is for the benefit of those people and all other people that we need to restore 2% inflation in this country on a sustained basis.
And thank you, but and the dual mandate suggests that those workers, that obviously you look out for those jobs and those workers, but we also know that those workers are the first to be laid off. And I would hope that in your next meeting, the Fed recognizes those disparities and gives them real weight as you make decisions that will likely at some point result in more layoffs. Probably my last question. Since you last testified in front of this committee, we've had 3 of the largest bank failures in U.S. history. You explored that a bit at the end of your testimony because the executives at those banks failed at Banking 101. Regulators took swift and decisive actions to protect the banking system and depositors. Thank you for that. That's in stark contrast to regulators' supervisory failures in the years before the 2008 financial crisis. What actions are you taking today to prevent more bank failures and to make sure banks do real risk management and address liquidity and other basic risks? And you may in part want to answer, I mean, he can do it himself, but Ranking Member Scott's comments on Vice Chair Barr and where that takes us. But what do you do to make sure banks do real risk management and address liquidity and other basic risks?
So I would say we are committed, and I am personally committed to learning the right lessons from what happened in Silicon Valley Bank and the other 2 failures, and vigorously implementing appropriately. I think there's a clear need to strengthen both supervision and regulation of banks of that size. And I can go into more specifics in the course of the hearing, but I do think we need to learn those lessons, and I think we've started to do that. And it's something, what we saw was an unexpected bank failure overnight led to contagion and threatened the broader banking system, and that's not supposed to happen. And we're gonna take appropriate measures to reduce the chances that something like that would happen.
Let me follow up briefly on that. The Fed plans to propose an overhauls we've talked about to existing bank capital requirements, so we have a more resilient banking sector. Is increasing capital requirements for banks with $100 billion or more in assets to prevent future bank failures, is that a strategy the Fed plans to, is willing to deploy to promote financial stability?
So we have not come to there hasn't been a final proposal. There's been a proposal that's been circulated, but it's, in my understanding, it's not final, and I know things are still moving around a little bit, so I don't really have a final proposal that I can comment on. I do think that the capital increases that are getting so much notice are really on the larger banks. There may be also some capital increases in the proposal for banks down to $100 billion, but not below that.
And yesterday you said we want to, in particular the G7, the 8 largest banks, to have very high levels of capital and liquidity. You stand by that statement?
I did, and I said, of course, we did spend years raising capital and liquidity standards a great deal on those institutions, and I supported all of that. And then I concluded by saying that further increases, if they are proposed, will need to be justified. They'll, of course, as any change in rule would be.
Senator Scott.
Chairman, let's stay with the capital requirements as you and Chairman were talking about on the larger institutions, but frankly, throughout the entire banking system. Pre-financial crisis, capital levels were in the single digits. In the last decade, it seems capital is continually being raised. My question is, how much is too much, and when is enough enough? We are going down a path where something happens or something goes wrong, and the only default solution seems to be to raise the capital standards or the capital on the sidelines. And the formulas that I use are really simple formulas. The higher the capital standards, the lower the capital for the private sector, which means fewer loans and less capital for those who are actually creating jobs. And so when we have too much capital on the sidelines and we have too little capital for actually creating and producing a vibrant economy, at some point, if you've raised it from single digits just a decade ago during the crisis, pre-crisis, to now frankly, rumors are as high as 20% for our GSIBs is a possible outcome. How much is too much?
I think that's exactly the right question. As you point out, there is a trade-off between making the banks safer, more secure, more resilient. You want them to be very strong, particularly the largest banks, so that they can continue to intermediate and lend money and things like that, continue to function during even stressful situations. But it's with bank capital, it's always going to be a trade-off between the availability and cost of credit and how much safety. And I think that's the question we're going to be addressing and answering as part of this process.
As you continue to work on fighting inflation, which I think is job one, another simple formula for those of us in the real world of business, we hear a lot of celebration around the jobs that are being created and the wage growth, but the way I look at it is wage increase minus inflation has led to less spending power. Do you disagree with that?
No, I think that's right.
Yeah. And so in the end, as we celebrate what seems to be a healthy economy, the truth of the matter is that the average person in our nation today struggles to make their ends meet because of the inflationary impact on their bottom line. And what that means for them is that there's a crisis for a single mother like the one that raised me, or seniors on fixed incomes. And we have yet to, as a nation, adjust for the 500 basis points increase in how we service our debt. Said differently, the more money we have to use for servicing our debt, the less money we have for meeting the needs of the American people. Therefore, printing and spending $4 trillion after COVID was over has led to the inflation that we're seeing, and that, as a result, led to the 10 rate increases. So how do you, as chairman of the Federal Reserve, talk to policymakers about the importance of being responsible from a monetary perspective? I know I've seen and heard your comments that that's not your lane, but certainly the actions that we take here impacts, frankly, significantly what you have had to do in order to slow down Biden's absolutely explosive inflation.
Let me start by saying that actually you were talking about real wages a moment ago.
Yes.
Real wages actually did go up at the lower end of the income spectrum, and now they are
Bottom
positive,
quintile.
but they're not as positive as we'd like to see them.
Yes.
So, but to your real question, I would just say this, that the U.S. federal budget is on an unsustainable path. It has been so for a long time. We need to deal with that sooner or later, and sooner is better than later. But that's what I can say, and that's what essentially all of my predecessors have said. We are not charged with supervising fiscal policy in any way. It's just, but as a high-level matter from the standpoint of the economy, that's what I can say.
Well, here's another analogy that works for me as a former football player, a running back. If my line isn't blocking and I keep getting my head hammered, I'm going to say something to the line. At some point, I think it's your responsibility to talk about the importance of fiscal responsibility. That to the side, my last thought and question for you is that SVB suffered because their bond portfolio ended up carrying water in a negative way. You have a $8 trillion balance sheet and beyond. Every report that I've read is that your bond portfolio, our bond portfolio, the Fed, is underwater as well. Can you talk to me about the losses that you're experiencing at the Fed from a bond perspective?
Remember that the way it works at the Fed is when we buy assets during QE, we pay for them with overnight interest rate reserves, and we've for many, many years during the QE era we've earned a spread, and we've been sending money to the Treasury way over $1 trillion since QE started. And so now that rates have gone back up to 5%, that process has reversed. And these are paper losses. They have absolutely no effect on our ability to conduct monetary policy or really on the economy. It's an accounting effect. If we retained capital, then that would be it would look completely different. But we don't. We give all of our profits to the Treasury.
So you were giving profits to the Treasury, now you're not. That has an actual effect. I mean,
Well,
if I was getting $10 and now I'm not, there's an effect.
Well, the Treasury then will have to borrow money that it doesn't get or raise taxes. It'll have to get the money to
Correct.
carry out the spending that Congress authorizes. Yeah. But that's not going to really, it's not going to affect interest rates and things like that much.
To me, I have the holistic view of our economy where if, in fact, we have fewer dollars coming in, which requires us to raise taxes, that in the end has a real impact on American taxpayers. But thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Scott, Senator Menendez, New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. After announcing the rate hike pause last week, you said that inflation has not reacted much to the Fed's past hikes. And I'll admit I'm a bit puzzled by that statement. The Fed's, when non-core inflation was at 8.6%, it is now 4%. And core inflation has fallen as well. So that sounds like progress to me, especially when you consider that according to the San Francisco Federal Reserve, it can take more than a year for tax rate hikes to take full effect, which means that so far only 3 of the 10 rate hikes since last year are in full effect. So can you expand a bit more on that statement from last week? What progress do you expect to see that you currently aren't seeing?
Sure. So, of course, you're absolutely right. Headline inflation has come down by essentially half, but that's largely due to energy prices coming down and commodity prices that go into food coming down. And those are not, I won't say that they're not affected at all by monetary policy, but they're principally affected by other things in the economy. You know, the war in Ukraine drove energy prices up quite a bit, and also food prices. That's not really, those things are not principally a function of monetary policy, although we probably have some effect at the margin. So we look at core inflation, and we look, at how tight the economy is. We are seeing progress, for example, in supply chains getting better. That, again, is not really a function of monetary policy. Really, where monetary policy takes effect is in the service sector, and that's where we haven't seen much progress. So, but we are seeing progress in other places, as you point out. Inflation broadly is coming down, but as I said in my remarks, we still have a long way to go. Inflation is still running between 4% and 5%.
So do you think that the lag period for rate hikes to affect inflation has lengthened, or are rate hikes as a monetary policy tool becoming less effective?
I don't think they're becoming less effective, but these are real questions. And the thing with lags is, this day and age, financial conditions react before we act. So the markets are already pricing in rate hikes. So that's quicker. But the effect of those financial conditions on the economy still takes time. It works very quickly on housing, for example, but less so on the service sector, which is not very interest sensitive. So I don't think that has changed. Others have a different view and different directions they think in which it's changed. There's not a consensus agreement on how long monetary policy takes to affect the economy. So some people think a very long time, some people think right away. So I tend to think let's look at the middle of that, and a year and change is that's not a bad way to look at it. But policy actually started tightening well before that. Before we didn't raise rates until March, but policy had already tightened substantially before the first rate hike in March.
Well, I will say, I know that you have a dual mandate, you know that as well. The last jobs report shows that unemployment is starting to tick upward for women and African Americans. So I hope that the cure is not more consequential than what we're trying to achieve. Recent reports reported that there's almost $1.5 trillion in commercial mortgages that will come due in the next 2 years, many of them held by small and regional lenders. With property values declining and interest rates rising, these mortgages could be serious liabilities for many banks. Do you think that we may see some banks fail as these mortgages come due? And if so, what can we do ahead of time to prevent that scenario?
So we're spending a lot of time on these issues, and we have been for quite some time. And again, I think you put your finger on it. It's really which banks have concentrations, high concentrations of real estate, and that is not seen in the large banks. It's seen in some of the smaller banks. So we've identified those banks, and there's a supervisory toolkit where we work with banks to try to help them resolve those issues by raising capital or dealing with what's happening. And of course, what is happening in the office space nationally there's an issue with people working from home and just less demand. There's a sort of one-time adjustment going on. There are also some other pockets of commercial real estate where there's some softness. So we're working with banks to work our way through this. We're very aware and very focused on the problem.
Well, I'm concerned that it's a ticking time bomb. And let me just say that last week you said that commercial real estate risks are unlikely to pose a systemic risk because the loans are broadly spread and mostly held by smaller banks. But how can we ensure that the potential losses in the commercial real estate don't lead to the draining of assets from smaller and mid-sized banks, and then create further consolidation in the banking sector that brings us back to, I don't want to be back to 2008 when I was here and was asked to do extraordinary things.
We certainly don't want to be there either. And so we're being pretty proactive about reaching out to these institutions and trying to help them get through these significant issues. Again, it's not all smaller banks. It's just some of them have high concentrations in real estate, and it's not in the large banks, which of course was where the problem was in 2008 and 9.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Chairman. Senator Kennedy of Louisiana is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Mr. Chairman, and to your colleagues. Thanks to all of you for giving so much to our country. As you know, our fiscal year, meaning the federal government's fiscal year, begins October 1. We're in the process of putting together a budget. If we pass a budget, we meaning Congress passes a budget that increases spending by, let's say, 10%, roughly $650 billion, what will be the impact on inflation?
So if it's, it depends on, of course, if it were funded by tax increases or other spending cuts, I guess in your hypothetical, it's not. It's so I think deficit spending at the margin stimulates the economy at the margin. It's a big economy, though.
And what will be the impact on inflation?
It would probably be a small
Todavía
effect
continuamos por
on
acá,
inflation
mercados
ultimately,
bastante
but there would be
lentos.
an effect
Quiero bajarle
through
un poquito el
stimulation of
volumen.
the economy.
Mercados
It
bastante
would be
lentos,
more
todavía
demand,
no hay
which
mucho
would-
movimiento.
Just in general, I'm not commenting on.
I know.
Sort of
Es
commenting
una
on fiscal
conferencia
policy, but nonetheless, it
que al
would be it
final,
would
si
be an
nos
effect
vamos
on
por
inflation.
acá,
I'm just asking you about basic
ni
economics.
siquiera ha bajado tanto el eurodólar.
I just read a piece.
Pares totalmente quietos. Obviamente
by
las
one
libras,
of
esta
your
variación fue
economists
por la
from the
subida de
San
tipos de interés
Francisco
en
Fed,
temprano,
Mr. Shapiro,
pero de ahí bastante lento.
who's arguing that
Voy a seguir
labor
escuchando porque
costs
estoy
had
fuera
virtually
de
nothing to
cámara,
do
no
with
hablo, pero
service
sí estoy
inflation
escuchando.
and a
Creo
negligible
que vamos a dejar cerrada la transmisión por acá. Esta semana era lo más crucial esto por si había un gran cambio, una gran modificación. Yo les dije el día de ayer.
and I read this
Recién
stuff
el día de ayer el
from
mercado
some of your people, and I
pues
just wonder what plan
pudo haber
they're
generado
putting
grandes
in from.
movimientos. Hoy es exactamente
If
lo mismo.
Congress passes
Lo mismo.
a
Entonces,
budget,
voy a compartirles esta transmisión para que continúen las personas que quieran. Y con el resto de personas, pues nos estamos viendo el día lunes a las 7 de la mañana, ya con el horario normal de transmisión. Ojo a eso, horario normal de transmisión. Sin nada más que decirles, amigos, pues les comparto esta comparecencia, esta testificación para que sigan escuchándola. Y nos vemos el día lunes 7 de la mañana. Que les vaya muy bien y que tengan un excelente fin de semana. Chao, chao.
Forget.